Thank you.
Great. All right, if we turn to page 4 of the document, I'm just going to touch on the highlights because there's a lot of information in this report. You can see that Howard County will receive around $400 million in state funding in fiscal 2022. Of this amount, around $332 million is direct aid, and this funding will go directly to the local government. Around $65 million is for retirement payments. This represents a 1.9% increase in state funding over the prior year, with total state aid increasing by $7.4 million from the prior year. Direct funding will increase by $4.9 million, and retirement payments will increase by $2.5 million. The majority of state aid to local governments goes to the public school systems. For Howard County, around 75% of state aid will go directly to the local school system, and 15% of state aid will cover teacher retirement payments. So in total, around 90% of the state aid that goes to Howard County goes for public education. The county government gets around 2% of the state aid that goes to local governments. You can see that in fiscal 2022, this year, Howard County Public Schools will get around $300 million in direct funding. This is a $3.4 million or 1.2% increase from the prior year. State funding for teachers' retirement payments will total around $59 million, which is a $2.4 million increase. We will now focus our attention to the state funding that is provided to the county government. If you turn to and you can see here that around $8.8 million will be provided to the county government. If we turn to page 7 or page 12 of the report, it shows you the amount of funding that goes to the police aid program. And you can see that the Howard County is scheduled to get around $3.9 million in funding for the police aid program. And as you can see on page 13, most of the funding that is provided to local governments is based on population density. The majority of funds is based on this, and more urbanized jurisdictions receive a higher per capita grant amount because they have a higher population density. Around 5% of the funding is based on the number of municipal sworn officers. If we turn to page 15, it provides information on the level of funding for fire and rescue aid. And here, Howard County would get around $600,000 in funding. The state allocation for the fire aid program is based on each jurisdiction's share of property tax accounts out of the statewide total. And there is a minimum $300,000 in funding for each jurisdiction. And if we turn to page 17, and 19, it provides information on local highway user revenues. And here you can see that Howard County is scheduled to get around $3.6 million in funding. Funding for county and municipal governments is based on each jurisdiction's share of road mileage and vehicle registration. Under the program, a certain amount of funding is allocated to Baltimore City. County governments gets a certain portion, and then municipal governments gets a certain portion. And then the county and municipal share is allocated based on road mileage and vehicle registration. So for the county government, the three main programs that they receive funding for is police aid, fire aid, and local highway user revenues. Now we're going to focus our attention to education aid, which is the main unit that receives funding. And if you turn to page 26 of the report, it puts the funding on a per pupil basis. And so here you can see that the Howard County school system would get around $356 million in funding. On a per pupil basis, this is around $6,400 per pupil. Direct aid is around $5,300 per pupil. And funding for teachers' retirement is around $1,100 per pupil. And you can see that Howard County is ranked 19th in the state based on funding on a per pupil basis. And this is due to the fact that most of the education aid provided to local governments is based on local wealth. And we'll go over that in a minute. If we turn to page 28, you can see that on a per pupil basis, funding for the Howard County school system is going up by 4.1%. And there are several factors that is affecting the level of funding that is provided to local governments this year. Typically, local school systems funding is based on their increase in student enrollment and the impact on local wealth. However, this year, due to the sharp decline in student enrollment that has resulted from the COVID-19 pandemic and the implementation of online instruction, there has been a significant decrease in funding that has been provided through the education funding formulas. And so you can see that on page 33, for the major funding formulas, if we just base it on the current student enrollment count, state aid would have gone down by $204 million. However, the governor has provided around $214 million in hold harmless grants to prevent this decrease in funding from happening. And as you can see, Howard County is projected to get around $7.9 million in the hold harmless grant, which will prevent the school system state aid from declining this year due to the lower student enrollment counts. If we go back to page 32, it provides information on the level of state funding that is provided under the Blueprint initiatives. And you can see around $500 million is provided statewide under the current Blueprint plan. Howard County is scheduled to receive around $11.9 million in funding. This includes around $4.2 million for supplemental instruction and around $2.7 million for special education grants. The school system will also get around $500,000 for full-day pre-kindergarten programs, and they are eligible to receive additional funding under the early childhood expansion. A considerable amount of funding is also based on targeted student populations. You can see here for the compensatory aid program, the funding is based on free and reduced price meal count. We also have the English language learners program and special education. And here you can see that Howard County's public schools is expected to get around $60 million in funding under these programs. You can see that the per pupil amount is quite low compared to other jurisdictions. And this is due to the fact that Howard County has the fourth lowest share of students receiving these targeted funds. You can see that for the targeted student index, Howard County is at 39.1%. And this index adds together the percent share of students that are approved for free and reduced price meals, for English language learners, and for special education services. And you can see that statewide, around 64% of students receive these services. It ranges from around 29% in Carroll County to over 100% in Baltimore City. And the reason why Baltimore City's index is over 100 is that there's some overlap in children that receive compensatory aid and the other two programs. We will now briefly look at the student enrollment trends. So if we go to page 43, it kind of shows you what is happening this year. Statewide, student enrollment is down by 2.3%. As you can see, only one school system in the state actually had an increase in their student enrollment, and that was Dorchester County at 0.5%. Queen Anne's County had a 4.5% decrease, and Howard County is kind of in the middle with a 2.8% decrease. And so this is the main reason why we had the hold harmless grants this year, because this is basically an anomaly, and it's basically due to the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic and virtual learning. As you can see that Baltimore City only had a 0.6% decrease in their student enrollment. And that was a school system that typically has declining student enrollment. Typically, all the other school systems typically has increases in their student enrollment. So this definitely is an anomaly this year. This is also is evident in our targeted student populations. Here you can see that statewide, there's a 6.7% decrease in the number of students approved for free and reduced price meals. But in Howard County, there's actually has been an increase of 1.8%. You can see here that Howard County has the third lowest share of students approved for free and reduced price meals at around 22%. The state average is around 41%. And the highest is in Baltimore City, where 88% of their students are approved for free and reduced price meals. The next page gives us information on the number of students that are identified as English language learners. And here you can see that around 10% of the state's students are English language learners. And Howard County is ranked 10th with 6% of the student population identified as English language learners. And here you can see that there is a 2.4% decrease in the number of English language learners in Howard County. The next page provides information on students receiving special education services. And here you can see that Howard County has the third lowest share of students receiving special education services at 10.7%. The statewide average is around 12.8%. So as you can see, for the targeted student populations, Howard County has a relatively low portion of students receiving these services, and that does impact the overall amount of funding that is provided for public schools. In addition, the funding under the current bill and the blueprint initiatives, a large portion of that funding is targeted to students receiving special services, particularly the concentration of poverty grant. As you can see on page 47, Howard County has the highest percentage of the share of their overall population that are public school students. 17.1% of county residents in Howard County are public school students. The statewide average is 14.1%. We will now focus a little bit on local wealth. And if we go back to page 40, it basically shows you how local wealth is calculated. It's basically a combination of your local property wealth and your local income wealth. And these are the two main revenue sources for local governments. It's around 90% of the local revenues for Howard County. As you can see, that overall, Howard County has the 8th highest local wealth index. When you look, which is around 111% above the statewide average. If you look at property wealth, once again, Howard County is ranked 8th with their per pupil wealth at around 106% of the statewide average. And for local income, Howard County is ranked 4th at around 120% of the statewide average. Now, due to your overall higher share of public school students, you can see that your per pupil ranking is slightly below your overall per capita rank. When you just look at per capita, Howard County is basically the 3rd wealthiest in the state after Worcester and Talbot, but due to your overall high share of, 4th, right after Worcester, Talbot, and Montgomery, but due to your overall higher share of public school students, you're basically ranked 8th. There are 2 more issues we want to address, and that deals with the proposed funding reductions that was introduced by the governor in his proposed budget. He included around $31 million in reductions to state aid programs. Howard County's share of these reductions is around $3.1 million. These reductions affected the community college program and property tax assessments. However, his proposal had to be approved by the General Assembly, And as part of the state budget deliberations, the Senate Budget and Taxation Committee and the House Appropriations Committee jointly rejected these reductions, so they are not included, and they will not be included in the state final budget. So right now, all of these state aid programs are fully funded. In addition, the governor has introduced supplemental budget number 1, which will provide around $150 million in additional funding for public schools, and a portion of that funding will be provided to Howard County. So that concludes my presentation. There is a lot of information that I did not cover. We'll be more than happy to talk with you if you have any questions, but I just wanted to go over some of the main highlights.
Well, thank you very much for being here and sharing this information. I do see we have a question from Delegate Ebersol. If you can please try to be quick with that. And if it requires more conversation, maybe you can follow up offline.
It may, and no preamble here. Thank you for your presentation. It was excellent. On both pages 35 and 44, excuse me, you referenced local wealth and you talked about it with reference to farms. And my only question is that we sometimes have difficulty with that because community eligibility means we don't gather new farms data. Do you have any information about how we balance that out in that situation?
I will have to get back with you on that with our education analyst who basically deals with the certification of farm students.
Right. We just don't get new data on them from year to year. So there's always been concern with community eligibility, but thank you. Maybe we could have a conversation or you could get an answer from me on that.
Okay, very good.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Quick enough for you, Madam Chair. I tried to go fast.
Thank you. Wonderful. Thank you very much, Mr. Birch, for being with us. Appreciate this information and appreciate the offer for any follow-up of additional questions that members.
All right, thank you.